and thank you. Allie, how'd I do? Allie told me I had a timer, so I wanted to make sure I did it without the timer.
You only were asking about your time. How about your legend?
We'll see. I can do some more.
Yeah. Thank you, Germane. That was great. I got a few questions.
Okay.
One of the things that one of the things that's interesting in your work is, like, I was reading all your descriptions, before you came up here and seeing it tonight, that like the forms of your work is kind of colorful. You might call it abstract, but it always seems like there's, well, you said it at the beginning, sort of story.
Mm-hmm.
But they always seem to have kind of a symbolic purpose, a set of references. I'm just wondering, do you think that people are seeing that when they, I can see in all the pictures people engaging in the work. Do you think people are seeing some of those stories that you're
Yeah. If we go backwards, so the Rock Road installation from 2022, a lot of people would tag me in it and say this reminds me of Carnival without me actually having to say it. Because the moment they would sit within the structure, they would feel like they have on the regalia that you see when you go to, when you see Juve and these other types of things. So certain things, I jokingly tell people my practice is, if you know, you know, which means like I don't want to describe stuff. So like when people see the young girl getting her hair braided, like they get it. And they immediately know what that means. They don't need an architecture degree to be able to understand those things. So it does take a lot of writing and references to make sure we have something that isn't making it isn't reducing the intellectual capacity, it's just making it more relatable, right? Like, that's what our goal is how can we do this so that people who don't have an architecture background still understand the spatial component of the work without making them feel bad for not being architects or for being urbanists, et cetera.
Yeah, because you didn't show it tonight, but one of your projects you did those designs for chairs.
Yep.
Because yeah, the porch is one of your themes, and the chairs on the porch, and then those chairs are, a bunch of chairs are designed like hairpins.
Yep. Yep.
But I just am struck by the way in which the forms, you could experience them as just abstract, but they're always colorful, so it's always kind of playful and abstract, but there's always a kind of, iconography, kind of significance.
Yeah, I think that goes to, I like things that are identifiable, things that immediately evoke memory. Again, we're going back to this idea of real and verbal narratives and sort of oral histories. It's always like the one component everybody remembers. It's maybe the large green pan that every family has, or maybe it's the couch that has the plastic on it, or maybe it's the blanket that has a bunch of floral arrangements. That, like, every single family has this thing. And so if that's the starting point, then I can manipulate that using architecture and design into something that's new, but still has that reference. And so the actual reference for MoMA was the Ebony Test Kitchen, because Ebony had did this amazingly beautiful kitchen with paisley patterns on the outside. I think it was just acquired by some institution. And so when I was approached, I told the curatorials team, I don't want to make a single drawing. I just want to make my own version of the Ebony Test Kitchen, so that when people go downstairs to Ebony, they can come upstairs to mine, and they go upstairs on the fourth floor, they'll go to this historic kitchen, which was like one of the most innovative things you saw back in the 1930s. And then COVID happened. And they said, Germane, you have to reduce the scale, because if things are too big, we have a line of people, and we can't have people within 6 feet of each other. So that's why the full kitchen became a spice rack. But because I'm black, it's like we have 8 different types of salt. It's not a spice rack, it's a spice wall. So that's why it became a wall instead. Seriously.
But it's interesting. I kind of think for people my generation, we went to school. What shall I say? Give it away. But in the 80s, all the postmodernism was maybe it was kind of on the ebb at that time. But I think the next generation reacts against all that kind of what they think is like the kind of artifice of symbolism. And I think that one of the things I was was really enjoying about your work is the kind of mingling of symbolic efforts and playful abstract form, and they seem to mingle seamlessly without effort, without problems.
Oh, it's a lot of effort.
Well, no, I mean, yes. I don't need your effort. There's always effort behind all design. Yeah. No, but you make it seem that way. You want it to seem, you don't want the others to feel your own.
Yeah, you never want anybody to know the secret recipe, right? You just want them to see the end and be like, wow, how did that happen?
Yeah.
And I can honestly say a lot of it really happens from us just joking around in the studio. Like, what if we made chairs that look like hair picks? And then somebody says, all right, let's try it. And then we literally try to do those things. We just throw things off the wall. And then if we can make it, then we do it. So also to students, when your professors tell you to make models or to draw the stuff, they're saying that for a real reason. Because if it stays in the computer, you have no idea how gravity reacts with it. So when we do stuff, we literally make everything. We do mock-ups of every single thing that we do internally. We have so much scrap. Like, there's chair pick heads all over the place. There's old discarded wrappings that were the ones for the labels that we didn't like. Like, all the stuff we do internally. And then the world sees the one that we like the best. But we always go through this iterative process of like 5, 6, 7, 15, 20 before we get to a point where we're actually happy.
I'm going to give the audience a chance to ask some questions too. So, anybody have questions out there? There must be.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. And firstly, I love your brave expression. And my question is, in your projects, what is the role of community? Like, what's the role of community engagement in the whole process? As a designer, do you design the space and then you see how the community of people are reacting to it?
No. No, so man, the amount of time we spend having a feedback loop with the community, that's an entire phase. Like, typically we know programming, schematic, design development, etc. But for us, after programming, we get to the community stage, and that community stage informs the schematic stage. So, for example, the Delray Beach project you saw, the amount of times I had to go back to convince this church population that it was okay to have a glass storefront, because they said to me, we want more glass. So if we want more glass, here's a storefront. Well, that seems expensive. You asked for it. This is a thing that you wanted on the building. And that's when you begin to understand that for a lot of communities that are sometimes under-resourced, there's this inherent desire to stop what they see as frivolous spending. Because the money that's going to a glass facade can go towards a social program that somebody in the community needs that might be more important than having the glass. And then that's when I learned, oh, the best way to get my point across is to explain to them, you deserve nice things in your neighborhood as well. You shouldn't have to leave your neighborhood to go somewhere else. And then when you get there, complain about the fact that this isn't in your neighborhood. And so it's an entire feedback loop, and back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, before we get to a point where we're like, all right, we now have approval, we can keep going. For any community project we work on, we do not immediately jump into design without having intense conversations with local stakeholders and community leaders. And most times that means we have to be there at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. because that's when we get off work. Or it means we have to give up a weekend because everybody works from Monday through Friday. These are the sacrifices that go into doing community-oriented work. And the other thing nobody ever tells you, it takes a long damn time. Like, it's not a quick process where it's 18 months, 24 months. We've been doing this project for 2.5 years. Nothing's built yet. We just got to 15% DD. And I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed that at our next construction meeting on Monday, we can continue going forward, because all it takes is one person that wasn't at a meeting the week before to come back and say, well, why is the bathroom there? And then next thing you know, you're trying to convince somebody about why you're an architect. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You mentioned, perhaps this is a too long an answer for you, but in the video you mentioned that the city of Miami has allowed your practice to flourish, your
Mhm.
design practice, and could you talk a bit more about your journey there and how you got it?
Sure. So, Miami is a very young city. I don't know how many of you all know, Miami's only like 105 years old. It's an extremely, extremely young city. There's people, humans that are just as old as Miami. And so for many people, like nobody sees Miami as a destination of practice. They see Miami as a destination of recreation. And so many people leave Miami to go to New York, go to LA, go to Chicago, go to these other big cities to be the lead designers. There's a consistent brain drain there all the time. And so when I moved there, I felt like there were just so many opportunities because there just wasn't that many people there yet. And so it allowed me to skip quite a few lines. If I had stayed in Los Angeles or stayed in Chicago, I would probably just be getting to a certain point. And so I had to make the conscious decision, all right, do I stay in Miami or do I leave and see if I'm actually talented or not? Because there's an issue of like the big fish in a small pond versus the other way, right? And I was like, well, if my career is done this well in Miami, why would I be stupid to leave? Why do I need to test myself in New York or Chicago and go through this unnecessary hazing where things are great and it's 85 degrees all the time? So I stayed there instead, and at a certain point, the larger global architecture community began to take focus and see the stuff that was going on, and it put me on the same platform as all of my contemporaries in those other cities. And when that happened, I really had no reason to leave at that point. And then they all started coming to Miami, like, how do I get the next Lexus project, or how do I get this next thing? And so it was really interesting in the way that that happened, and I absolutely know that if I had stayed in Chicago, Los Angeles, the speed of this would have never happened at the rate that it happened. I'm well aware of that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, thanks for an inspiring presentation. You were talking about making at the scale of like a drawing and model, so I was wondering if you enjoy the process between the renderings and the fabrication. Like I was wondering, especially for your Spain project, because I guess it makes sense if you have a fabricator who's like really local and you're friends with. And I was wondering how you found them in Spain and if you're like friends with them, and if that was like a positive process at all. Because yeah, it was really cool to see the jump from the render to the image with the light and shadow and stuff.
So I'll give you all a tiny peek behind the curtain. A lot of the renderings we do are after we've already finished the project. Like we sketch a lot. My architecture education was based on everything by hand. So for 4 years, all I did was draw stuff by hand. So in our studio, if you can't draw it, it doesn't exist. So sometimes my assistants are like, gee, what if we do this? I'm like, can you sketch it, please? No, I can't sketch it, then don't talk to me. Figure out how to sketch it, figure out how to draw it, and then we can have a conversation about it. And so we do that, once we finish iterating, then we just start building. We just start making models, we just start figuring out how to make stuff at scale. We do small little prototyping of just portions of it to see if it actually makes sense at that color palette. We have remnants of the chairs in the studio. And so when we got so good at that, it made it easier for us to talk with fabricators. Because everybody in the team understands connections and details before we even get to the fabricator. So when they ask us a question, we already ready. We need number 8 bolts. Just do them like this. We need this type of weld. Do this. Because that's how we work in the studio. So the project in Spain, they have their own fabricators. And all of that prep work helped us so that when it was time for us to communicate with those fabricators, we had a full set of construction documents already ready for them. Because a lot of times, if you all know, a contractor will tell you how to put your building together because you're not in charge of construction means and methods. They'll tell you, I'm gonna do it like this. And it may not end up the way you wanted it to end up, so the more information you can give, the better. Now, the Lexus project was the most fun project because those fabricators were based out of Portland, and they were like, hey, we've never done anything like this, but it seems really cool, so how about you just fly out to Portland and we figure this thing out together. And so that's what we did. Like we went out to Portland and we were like, all right, what if we use this type of rod? What if we use lights in this type of way? We do a very hands-on process because again, that's the way I was taught. And that's the way I was taught architecture was supposed to be. You do everything from the large scale all the way down to the detail. And so that's the way we run the practice.
Oh yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi there. You touched on this issue a little bit in your talk, and I just wondered if you elaborate a little bit more about the sort of hybridization of culture, especially in diasporic communities, and how that sort of shifts as it moves across water or across the country or across the neighborhood or across the city, and how that sort of informs your work as well, working in these communities.
Yeah, so yesterday I did a talk in Professor Richard Summers' class, and I made sure not to show anything that I showed yesterday, so the students would have to come today. But one thing I did show was actually a bunch of the research that I did on porches, and specifically showing how that space came from West Africa as the comeback, all the way through Haiti as the tea cave because of enslavement, and then into Southeast U.S. as the shotgun home, and how, depending on where you are, this thing gets manipulated, and the rituals of that space get changed as well as it becomes a shotgun home to a Greystone in Chicago or Double Wide in Detroit. And so I think for me, migration is super interesting because it shows how resilient people are and how clever and innovative they are. Because you're able to take this exact same space, the very generic porch, but you manipulate it into a way that allows for it to only make sense in DC, or only to make sense in Atlanta, or only make sense in Houston, and that machination. And so even though I didn't show it, some of the other stuff I did show was how, for instance, Rock Roll, that the Bahamian and Jamaican community there really do embrace the city as a space for play, but also bright, colorful, loud, so much sound. And that's why the ring chimes are so important. And trust me, a lot of those very expensive brands, because they was right there in the Zion District, which is nothing but LVMH and other type of places, they were pissed. Because it was just so much commotion. All it takes is one gust of wind, and the entire design district just was super loud, because every single wind chime would go at the exact same time. They were not happy with me at all. But I feel like I run really fast, so you just gotta catch me. So I think with a lot of these things, that's the way that we try to do is like, how do we bring in the narrative of people and places and don't appropriate? And that's the clever part, right? Like a lot of this work, I always make it clear to say, I am not Caribbean. I'm regular black in the US. And I say that because I don't want anyone else to feel like, well, he's adopting our culture. Like, I'm not. But I also know that there's so many overlaps in our culture, hence the food project from MoMA. And these are the commonalities that we have, so I'm going to celebrate these things. But I don't give away every single secret because you don't want it to be commodified. And that's why it remains, if you know, you know.
Thanks.
Just what about the fact that you're in Chicago and down in Miami? Do you ever feel like you're a visitor? You still feel like a visitor there?
Yeah, absolutely. I still feel like a visitor there because everywhere I go, I just want to get some good soul food. It's so impossible to get. Like, you just want to go get some really good candy yams and collard greens, and it's so bad because it's just not the food of some of these other places. And so you get Jamaicans who just make really, really bad macaroni and cheese, and you just like, this is blasphemy. But there's not much you can do about it. But I will say this, Michael Jordan has his number retired at the Miami Heat Stadium. So every time I go, I poke fun at the fact that your franchise retired our best player's number. So whatever you want to say about me not being here, we own you.
Hey Germane, that was a really inspiring talk. When you were talking about your community engagement, it sounds like ethnography, like part of the design process where you're mining for ideas. I was wondering how you deal with conflict resolution, where you have someone who says, this is absolutely important to me, and you have another group that absolutely disagrees. How do you navigate that within a community?
Ah, okay. So great question. Again, I feel like a lot of you might have overheard the lecture from yesterday and it brought a lot of questions. Did you put plants in the crowd, Richard? So I did not show a project that we were just awarded, and that project is in Dallas, Texas. And it's called the Fred Rouse Center for Community Healing. It was a former KKK headquarters that then became a pecan factory that is now derelict. And a coalition of community groups, LGBTQIA+, young people, black churches, created a nonprofit purchased this property and did a search for a design architect, an international search. My team won. And so it'll be our first cultural project. I think it's like a $40 million project. And one of the biggest things is one part of the community says, burn that damn thing down. Like it's a relic of a time that still exists, even though it's covert. And it's a reminder of all the harm that's been done to blacks and Jews and Mexicans in that community. And there's the other side that says, don't burn it down, because if we remove it, then how do we prove to people that this thing existed? How do we prove to people that we have to not repeat the same unfortunate histories over and over and over again? And so as the design architect, we find ourselves in the middle. Half the community says burn it down, the other half says keep it. So in that case, we end up negotiating a lot between both types of groups that oppose each other. And we use a consensus model. Consensus models take a long time because everybody gets a chance to express how they feel, as opposed to like the fake democratic model where there's just vote, or the 2/3 model of majority vote. So after consensus, we said, what if we just tear down most of it? So that way those don't see the same version. And then what if we do this thing where we reconstitute the materials, what we torn down, and these become things that you can step on or dance on, or things that show that you're liberating, that you're joyful at the expense of this horrific history. And so that's why the community engagement part is its own phase for us, because for a lot of projects we do, there's a lot of people who've been mistreated or had a lot of promises that were broken, and a lot of times we're just therapists, like we're not even architects. And that's why I jokingly told Richard yesterday, I always call myself an architectural anthropologist, not an architect, because there's so much things we have to do just speaking to people and understanding their history and their story. And then once you do that and you meet a person on an eye-to-eye level, they're more inclined to put trust in you. But if you talk down at people and you say, I'm the expert, I know everything there is to know, you don't know anything, it's not gonna go well. Especially when I'm not from Fort Worth, Texas. All I know is barbecue. I don't know anything else about Texas, but the people that are there know this history. And so we empower them and they empower us, and that reciprocal relationship typically bears fruit. Again, we're just in the schematic design phase, so I'm not past that or anything, but hopefully it continues to go well.
Just curious, I mean, because you're kind of navigating the different points of view about that very tricky topic, but it's a topic which is, you know, it's relevant for a lot of other monuments of all the Confederate statues. And, you know, we have the history of residential schools in Canada, renaming institutions and things like that sort. And I'm just wondering what your own thoughts are about this question of preservation or demolition. Because when you enter into that conversation, obviously you're trying to sound out the different constituencies or points of view, really. But you also must bring something to it yourself.
Yeah, preservation is difficult. Like, I hate the idea of preservation because it's just who has the most time to write a whole bunch of pieces of paper. Like, that's what preservation really comes down to. Do you have enough time to fill out a 100-page document that says that something is historically relevant and submit it to somebody that's full of arbitrary people who get to decide if they find it relevant or not? And so in that sense, I'm not a fan. But I also understand that there are things that exist in the built environment that whether you give them significance or not become monuments. So like in Chicago, you'll see this teddy bear on a tree, and if you see that teddy bear, that means somebody died right there, and that becomes the monument. If you're in Chicago and you know the story of Emmett Till, you know that house when you go by. That's a lot different than erecting a statue to Christopher Columbus, who was a moron. So like, in that way, it's like I'm always interested in the things that people hold dear and like why they put certain things on pedestals. But you have to understand that anytime you erect something to someone, you're gonna offend somebody, whether it's positive or negative, because everybody loves to complain. It's like that episode of The Simpsons when they're at the thing and that guy just keeps yelling. And it's like, why are you yelling? Because I want to. And it's like, that's what it is. Like people just enjoy yelling. So if you get past that first hurdle, you're able to understand that certain things exist not because it's worth a damn, but because that person persevered long enough through all the community meetings of yelling, and then their paperwork got stamped. and this other paperwork did not get stamped because that person got tired of that process. So we're doing a lot of work on monuments right now in East Germany, and we're trying to understand what that means as well, materials, labor, informal versus formal. So like, we're always trying to weave different things together. As you all can see, I try to do a whole lot of different types of things because I get bored very quickly, and then when I get bored, I jump to like, hey, let's make a movie. And then we made a movie, and it's like, I didn't show the movie, but it's like 7 minutes long, but we made a movie. And it actually won some awards, which is crazy. And it's like, hey, let's go design some chairs. All right, we're done with chairs. Let's go design some swings. We're done with swings. Let's go design a car. We're done with car. So we're always trying to find different stuff to do, and like through this entire process, it keeps us happy, it keeps us engaged, it keeps us rigorous, it keeps us intense. But I think these are all the things that architectural design allows us to do.
Well, you did say something else about preservation too. You know, you're distinguishing. I think you're making a distinction between the preservation of buildings, not necessarily monuments, but just historical architectural materials. Because they're all maybe they're sometimes good, not always. Versus preservation of I guess built social environments.
Yep.
And also referred to the way in which highways have demolished them. So preservation also has this other balance, I think, in your.
Oh, absolutely. And I think for me, the most important thing is preservation of culture. Like, that's the stuff that I'm most interested in. So if that culture means that tree that's over there that everybody has their stool by, because that's the important tree, and everybody knows you do not move those chairs, then to me, that's the culture that we have to preserve. Or if it's the wall that we showed that everybody sits along and they call it the porky beans, like that's the thing that we want to preserve. But again, you get into these issues of who is it for, who does it push back against, who's happy about it, who's not happy about it. But at its core, it's always for us about celebrating the culture of people, celebrating the histories of people, celebrating the joy of people, because so much of this stuff is always built on trauma, and I just get tired of being just flooded with trauma. Like, the world is a very crappy place. So if I can put just a little bit of sprinkle of color in the thing just to make you distracted for a little bit of time, and that's all it is a distraction, I feel like I've done my job.
I don't know if you've noticed in Toronto, but we have a particular regime of preservation. We have a lot of towers going up. I think the second most after Mexico City in North America. Not the most towers, but the most going up.
Yeah.
And almost all of them seem to stand on top of a 2 or 3 story building, usually a Victorian piece of commercial architecture, sometimes a house. Every single tower stands on top of a house.
You gotta love how this stuff works. I mean, buildings are buildings. I told this to the students yesterday, like, they exist, hooray. After that, it's like, let's keep going to the next thing.
Yeah, that would be nice sometimes.
You got one there.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was incredible and really inspiring. And in particular, I just want to bring back to, I guess, also related to preservation, but you mentioned a lot of the historically Black neighborhoods in Miami that have been, facing a lot of pressure from white people who are trying to revive or buy up these neighborhoods, and that transfers pretty directly to Canada in a lot of ways. A lot of our Black historic neighborhoods are also under this exact same kind of like white threat of gentrification. And in particular, there's been a lot of organizing around the kind of like community land trust model. A lot of Black-led community land trust models are working on preserving those cultural spaces and keeping them in the ownership of Black folks. But this has been really focused on like housing and affordable housing, the housing crisis. And you work with such playful and beautifully communal spaces and projects. I was wondering if you could speak to kind of the balance of maybe an urgent need of housing versus actual spaces that mean more for a kind of communal group of people.
So we unfortunately have not had the opportunity to do a housing project, just because in the States, housing is extremely expensive, and most developers don't want to give up their developers fee for affordable or workforce housing. Instead, they just continue to do luxury housing because it builds their bottom line. I wish we could get the opportunity to do a project like that, just because they're so necessary. I don't know if you want to know this, but like Miami is now the most unaffordable city to live because our housing, a single family, a one-bedroom apartment, I think it's about $2,300 a month, but the average income is less than $30,000 a year. So like, you literally cannot afford to live there, and wages have not gone up. And Florida is not a place that's rent controlled. So literally, every single time your lease is up, your landlord can raise it as much as they want to at their discretion, which is insane. You can go from 1,700 a month to 27 the next year, and there's nothing you can do about it except move out. So I'm always interested in alternative models of housing, like community land trusts, co-ops, and things of this nature, because there has to be some sort of solution. But in a place like Florida, where the laws are the laws and the leadership is the leadership, like, I don't fortunately see any type of change in how that can happen. And so that's why we focus on the communal spaces as well, because many people who can't afford housing still need somewhere to be. So we're trying to do this thing where we get a bunch of the churches in Delray Beach to plant fruit trees, so that the unhoused literally have access to food. And the person they said was no. And we're like, why? They're like, we don't want them to eat off the trees. It's like, ain't that the point? Like, the literal point, because you're a church, is to help people. So we plant some gumbo limbos for shade, we plant some avocado trees, we plant some different type of mango trees. And I actually had these type of slides, but I took them out to people with like 130 slides about putting them all in. But we literally, we convinced them to plant a bunch of trees. Like, we guilt tripped the hell out of them. So it's like, you said you're a church, you're supposed to help people. If we don't plant these trees, who are you helping? And it worked. So we were able to get a bunch of trees that were actually planted, but it's not easy to get people to want to do that. It's not easy to get people to want to do it, and there's not enough nurseries that are willing to donate these type of stocks of stuff to put there. Or people just hoard them for themselves. People are planting a mango tree and won't let anybody get access to it. And so we just try to find small interventions where we can insert ourselves, because again, we can't change all of policy no matter how much we try. And we do get some little wins, but the big ones like developer fees or the way we do tax market credits, things, that type of stuff, it's far beyond the state level, that's the federal level. So with all of that stuff, we have to find ways to get people to be excited about things, and we do it with parks, we do it with buildings, we do it with stuff like that, because those are temporary fixes until we can get to the larger things. The housing model, so with the Delray Beach, hopefully we'll finish this damn building and the Bahamian market by the end of this year, and then middle of next year, and then once those things are done, we can move on to the housing component that we're also trying to do for them as well. So keep your fingers crossed.
All right, I think we'll call it a night. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. I'm glad Toronto reminded you of Chicago. I'm sorry it wasn't as cold. You were complaining it wasn't cold enough. Come again, I promise it gets colder. Anyway, before everybody goes, let me just say a few things. I want to remind you that we have in our public programming series next Thursday night, urban planner Chelina Ogbert of Kakui Design Initiative, and she will speak on the subject of design and the just public realm. Her talk will take place here in New Hall at 6:30 p.m. on February 8th. And as I noted, Germane's lecture was the first event in our Black History, Black Futures Month series of offerings. So on February 15th, architect Kalisile D-Lee-Y, oh my goodness, D-Lee-Y-O will be here to talk about his Black Diasporas project, a community-led mapping initiative that examines the experiences, spaces, and places having meaning to Black people. And I urge you to all check out the display in our library, as well as our art installation in the historic stairwell between the second and third floors of the south side of the Daniels building here. So I invite you all to join us in the comments. Thank you all for coming.